Is it harder to raise $25 million to make a film, or is it harder to raise $1 or $2 million for a smaller film?
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye.
The answer is easy. It's harder to raise $1 million than $25 million. I'm just saying there's a prejudice against films under $1 million.
It's the People's Minister of Information, JR. We are still at the Black Comic and Art Festival. I ran into my comrade, my homegirl, the legendary artist, the curator of the Black Woman is God collection of art that's annual, Miss Karen Seneferu. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for this opportunity, JR.
How
are you, brother?
I'm good.
Yes, sir.
What is important about today and us being here at this Black science fiction, Afrofuturism? What is important about this?
Well, I think it gets back to some of the comments that were made today by the panelists. And I think one of them is acknowledging that we have permission to change our future. We can't change the future unless we first recognize that we have a right to it. And so acknowledging that and then imagining that future for ourselves, dreaming it, identifying what would we like to change about the reality of our community, our condition, and to what extent can we make that a global change and transition in society. So the ability to give ourselves permission, the recognition of our imagination, and then putting that to action.
What's the importance of the imagination?
The importance of the imagination is embedded in critical thinking. And critical thinking is necessary in order to change the conditions of the society. And of course, critical thinking can't happen without understanding one's culture. And that means that you have to understand that culture is arts, letters, and scholarly pursuits. So often when I teach at Cal State East Bay or Berkeley City College, one of the questions I ask is, what is your culture? Do you know, a simple question, do you know who are the artists that represent your culture? A visual artist, someone who is no longer alive but still making a dent in the society. And students of color will identify Picasso, and I'll say, are you Spanish? Or they'll identify Michelangelo, and I'll say, are you Italian? But they can't identify their own cultural reality. And I say to them, if they can't identify their own artistic representation of identity, then who are they? It means that they have to have someone else's culture embedded in their thoughts. And so that's why it's important to be critical, to be an artist, is to think critically and then make choices that shape not only the individual's identity, but the culture itself.
It's the People's Minister of Information, JR. We are at the Black Comic and Art Festival here at the San Francisco Main Library. I'm here with the science fiction, Black futurist, artist, author, Miss Jewelle Gomez. She has the Gilda stories that you may have heard of, as well as many other books. Miss Jewelle Gomez, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for stopping to talk with me.
Thank you for coming along. Can you tell the people a little bit about why and how you became a writer and when you knew you were a writer and how did that all occur?
I wanted to write since I was 8 years old. I didn't know what I wanted to write about until I was probably in my 20s. And I felt like I had something to express and it had to come out in writing. And as I got older, I saw speculative fiction, futurist fiction, as a way to show signs of hope about the future, particularly for people of color. The more we talk about the future and see how we could shape it to be different, to me means that's the hope that we have for changing the world.
See, a lot of times when I was coming up in the 80s and in the early 90s, when we talk about science fiction, we talk about Star Wars and Star Trek. And black people weren't really involved. Yeah. You know, even in the cartoon, the Jetsons. In the future, there were no black people.
There were no black people.
So, how do you see the genre now that you and so many other sisters are coming into it and blackening it? How do you see science fiction? What do you see your role as a black woman being in it as an author? And how do you see the genre moving into the future?
I feel like it's such a great opportunity for me as a writer to have all these other people of color starting to write in genre fiction. Because when I started out, there was Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany, and that's pretty much it for people of color in the field. And I felt like, ooh, can I really do this? So now, 30 years later, it's amazing that so many, certainly African Americans and other people of color, are writing speculative fiction. I mean, I wrote, my novel, The Gilda Stories, is a vampire novel. Other than Blackula, the movie, what black vampires were there? And it's, for me, a way to talk about our history, from slavery into the future, and how we are a part of the future, which we weren't seeing, as you said, we weren't seeing that in movies, we weren't seeing that on television. So I get to write about what are black people doing in the year 2050. And to me, that's a privilege. And again, it's my opportunity to make a suggestion about how we can be hopeful rather than just desperate and believing that we have to be resigned to our fate, which is poverty and violence.
Now, I'm a writer, but I'm a newspaper writer, and I use my 2 eyes and 2 ears, and you deal with science fiction, and you deal with your 3rd eye. Do you think that we do the same thing, or is it something that should be separated?
Well, my original training was as a journalist. I went to journalism school to get my graduate degree, and it was the best training I ever had because it did teach me to listen to people, to look at people, to see what was going on in the world around me. So I use that training now and then just take it the next step to extrapolate what possibly could happen. And I think that's a really good training. Journalist training is a really good training for anything you want to do. The only difference for me is you're not supposed to make up stuff.
Right. That's true.
Where I can take a fact, I can take any fact you give me, it's in the Bayview newspaper, and write a story about it. And it won't have to have anything to do with the actual facts, but it's a jumping off point. And that's how we define our world, really.
What is the importance of the imagination, particularly to black people, but to all human beings? But what is the importance of the imagination?
We can't really thrive without imagination because sometimes circumstances are so horrific. If we didn't have imagination, we could never grow past them. I mean, I grew up with my great-grandmother who was Native American. We lived on welfare in a cold water walk-up. But it was our imagination that made us know there was a bigger world out there and we could be part of it. She pushed me to read books. She pushed me to go to school. She pushed me to think out loud about things. And that helped me use my imagination, and I think that's the reason that I'm a writer today, because imagination is what moves us from here to the future.
It's been 25 years since you came out with your first book. Now looking back, quarter of a century later, how do you look at your first work?
Well, The Gilda Stories, my first novel, is a classic, I guess, at this point. It's been in print for 25 years. The new edition is, spruced up a little bit, but it's still the same words. Of course, if I were able to edit it, I would edit it a little bit because my writing has gotten better after 25 years.
But let me ask you this as just a writer, because I think as a writer, you're kind of like an artist, a perfectionist type. If you edited it, would it be the same story? Even if you took this line or that line out or tweaked it, would it be the exact same story with the exact same punch?
I think it would even have more of a punch because you can always write better. You can always write better, but it is that entity that everybody knows. So I can't really change it. But I am writing more Gilda stories for hopefully a second book, and my goal is to fill in some of the decades that aren't in the first book and some of the emotional inner life that aren't in the first book with Gilda, so we can see how Gilda has grown in her 200 years of life and how my writing has grown in my 25 years of writing.
How did you come up with doing a vampire story? I mean, black people don't usually think Transylvania, the sucking blood and all that. I mean, we had Blade that put it on the screen, but what made you put it in writing before Blade was even on the screen?
Well, I had an experience with some people who were kind of like assaulted me verbally on the street, and it really sent me over the edge. And I wanted to kill them, but instead I went home and wrote a story, and about a woman who gets assaulted on the street by these guys, and she ends up, of course, killing them because they don't know she's a vampire. And I looked for a story with a woman who has amazing power, physical strength, amazing power, and it ended up being a vampire. But then it gave me the opportunity to reshape the mythology. So she's not a serial killer. She doesn't kill people when she takes blood. She's a part of the larger community because for her, what's nourishing, in addition to the blood, is her connection to other people. How other people survive, how she can help them survive. I did a play based on the novel.
So she like an African-centered freedom fighter, vampire.
Right. She escapes from slavery when she's a kid, and ends up living for over 200 years trying to find community. The story's about how do you find community, how do you create community, what is it we need to survive? Do we need to be as violent with each other as people were to us, or do we move beyond that? And I tried to write that kind of story as an adventure so we could see ourselves as survivors and, people who are not the dregs of society. We are the kings and queens of society, and we're the hard workers. We are the people who work in the basement at this library,
The blue-collar people.
The blue-collar people. We're the people who are going to clean up after this festival is over. We're the teachers who show up every day even though nobody will give them books for their students. We are all of those people, and all of those people are needed to make the culture work. And we have to value the work that we do and value each other.
When you conceive of what you're going to write about, do you conceive it from page 1 to page 310, or does the story just start taking a life of its own as you write?
I do conceive of a full story when I start writing, but of course it changes by the time I get to page 310. I start out with an idea and I think it's where it's going, but the more I write, sometimes the characters evolve, the situation evolves, and I feel like I have to go with it. I mean, it's a very delicate balance, what you have to say about a character or a situation or the politics or the culture. And if you're not true to it, then the story isn't true. So it's an adventure. It's an adventure. Just like Gilda. The Gilda stories is a grand adventure. And the more people think about it like that, the more excited they are when they read it and don't even notice that they might be learning something.
Right. What advice do you give like young writers who don't necessarily have a genre that they fit into per se? I know that you were at that point once because you talked about Octavia Butler and the other brother being the only two that did what it is that you were going to do. What do you have to say to people that can't be defined by a genre, whether it's writing, music, or any kind of art?
I would say you are really fortunate if you don't feel like you fit into any particular genre or style. You're very fortunate because it means you make your own. You make your own path. I mean, I felt like I was frustrated because I didn't know which direction to go in. Now we have so many different people of color writing, making music, doing all kinds of things. You don't know if you're going to be Esperanza Spalding and, play the upright bass or cello or whatever that. I mean, who imagined we'd see an African American woman on TV playing that and singing? You could say you're, going to be a hockey player. I don't know why, but you could. Any of those things, because there are so many of us now doing those things. You can pick your own path, create your own path, and you'll figure out where you are when you get to it. I don't feel like it's not as a closed field as it was, say, 40 years ago when I started writing. If you had to write music, you were supposed to be writing either jazz or R&B, and then it became hip hop. You had to be writing hip hop in order to be an African American man, succeeding. But now you can write anything you want.
You made a very interesting comment on the politics in fiction and how you see the two playing apart. Can you speak to what is the connection between politics and fiction?
I would say that anyone who sits down to write is coming from a political perspective, whoever they are. It doesn't matter if they're Angela Davis writing a book of essays, or it's somebody writing a television show. Aaron Sorkin writing a television show is very political. But it could be somebody who doesn't think of themselves as political because they're writing, Frasier or Friends. But they're all coming from a political perspective. So
why do you say that?
Because we're human beings. We're coming, if I write a story about anything, I'm bringing myself to it. Whether I would identify as political, whether I'd say I'm a progressive or a conservative, my perspective is going to come out in my story. You think of someone like Henry James, probably one of the most famous writers in Western literature, and nobody would necessarily say he was political, but when you look at his stories, of course he's political. He's writing about certain classes of people, and his class perspective shows. It's one of the reasons that I love reading, of course I just blanked on his name, a lot of the British writers really deal with class very, very well, so I love a lot of British writers. Charles Dickens. One of the reasons I love Charles Dickens, he's always writing about class.
Great Expectations.
Great Expectations. He's always writing about class and how we are affected by it, how we are shaped by it. I just love that. So I, from my perspective, am going to end up reflecting, maybe not necessarily writing a treatise on my political views, but I'm going to end up reflecting my views. And it's in the word choice, what words you decide to use. It's in what you say about your characters. You can describe a character in a bunch of different ways, and there's a big difference between saying, she was fat and ashy, and saying she was a big woman who looked like she had been working hard. That's two different ways of talking about a person.
And saying the same thing.
And your perspective.
Different energy on it.
Exactly. And one of the good things I think about now is we get to be conscious. We get to be conscious of how our words affect other people and use them. Use them carefully. I believe it's a major power to be able to use words carefully, which is why it's fabulous for you to be a journalist, because you use your words carefully, because you know they're going to have an effect on the people who read them. You can say something about one thing and have people go, "Ew, I don't want to know about them," or say something else and people go, "Oh, I got to look that up." That power of words is amazing. That's why people burn books.
Well, I mean, like, look at even when we talk about putting words together, we call it spelling or spells.
Spells. I love that.
You know?
I hadn't even thought about that. Yes.
Spells.
It's spells. It's definitely spells.
Because I can change your emotions with the word.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
You know, so.
Absolutely. Wow. I have to think about that song.
Well, thank you, Ms.
All right,
Jewelle Gomez. I don't want to use up all your time, and I know that a number of people have been walking up since we've been doing the interview, so I don't want to hold you too long.
Assassinos! É tu louca que funge. Calma, Cambo! Angola, o nosso pai está morto! O papá morreu pelo chão de um dongo. Honrou o sangue dos nossos antepassados.
Acha que eles podem me trair?
Acho que só um herdeiro deve continuar vivo. E os umbigos dos outros devem ser todos enterrados no chão.
Mbandi não tem força nem inteligência para vencer a guerra contra os portugueses. Eu vou lá estar para defender o meu povo quando Mbandi cair. Fala só, Mbandi. Que pedido é esse?
Preciso que vás a Luanda tratar a paz com os Mundele.
M. Eu?
Sim. Tu és a Mucuz de Angola, Ginga. Nosso pai teria escolhido a ti para esta missão.
O reino do Ndongo é soberano. Não pode ser vassalo de outro. O Ndongo Xiame, nossa terra, a herança dos nossos antepassados. Eu lhe honro e lhe respeito e vou lutar por ela até vencer.
Manda lá aí, Maiai. Para que me queres aqui, Ginga?
Para desprender o nosso desejo.
Pelo poder que me é dado por El Rei de Portugal, declaro essa Ginga como a principal inimiga do reino português. Reúna todas as tropas que conseguir e marche contra ela. Quero a cabeça de Ginga.
Eu vou entregar-lhe uma salva de prata.
Os portugueses me traíram, me perseguiram, roubaram o nosso chão.
E nosso irmão? Ela estava lá a escutar para nos informar.
A guerra só nos tem prejudicado. As peças de escravos diminuíram. Nós não conseguimos encher as caravelas para enviar para o Brasil.
Qual é a proposta?
Nós não vos atacamos e vocês não nos atacam.
Mas para podermos honrar esse trato, vamos ter de eliminar a Ginga.
Façam com Ginga o que quiserem.
Eu vou dar luta aos meus inimigos até a eternidade. Não vou perdoar mais a vida a nenhum português.
O que é isso?
Mas que modos são esses com a princesa?
Os portugueses empurraram Ginga para fora do trono de Ndongo, mas os espíritos estão com ela. O trono pertence a Ginga. Nenhum vivo, nenhum morto pode nada contra isso.
It's the People's Minister of Information. I'm here with Jennings, the co-founder of the Black Comix and Arts Festival. This is the second annual. How are you, bro?
I'm good. It's great to be here. Seriously, just got in from New York.
Man, I'm here enjoying myself, learning about a whole lot of new, a bunch of new literature and a bunch of new authors. What is the importance of a Black Comic Fest where Black comics, Black futurists come together? What is the importance of that?
Well, here's the thing. I think one of the things is that the Black imagination is a powerful, not necessarily, a weapon, but also a tool for building the future, right? And I think that if you look at Mark Derry's original writing about Afrofuturism in his piece, Flame Wars, he conflates the idea of like Black science fiction with spaces like Milestone Media, which is like the first Black comic book company that was associated with DC back in the 90s. What's been happening that I love is the fact that movements like the Black Lives Matter movement or the anti New Jim Crow movement or thinking about gentrification and these particular types of pieces is sort of like it's intersecting with this idea of a Black speculative imagination. And so it's important for us to see ourselves reflected in the society that we participate in, right? These stories are extremely empowering to our children and to just basically artists and creators from all backgrounds. And the show, also too, there's another thing where a lot of people think that we're not into this particular type of culture, but did you see the piece where they found an old science fiction piece by W.E.B. Du Bois?
No.
Oh yeah, it's called The Prince of Steel. Well, he already was writing speculative fiction. He already wrote science fiction and fantasy. He has a piece called The Comet, right?
He published it?
Oh yeah. Definitely. Yeah, and actually, if you pick up like Dark Matter by Sherry Renee Thomas, which I think is they're selling, it's 100 years of speculative fiction because the idea of reimagining yourself in the past and the present is extremely powerful, and it's part of our heritage as people from the diaspora, you know?
Well, you talked a little bit about speculative. You keep using this word speculative, and I've never heard that genre until I walked into here.
Oh, wow.
Where did that word come from, or where did that genre title come from?
Here's the thing, it's an overarching ideology when you think about horror, the supernatural, what they call magical realism, science fiction, fantasy. These are based off of things that are outside the known realm, you know? This speculation, the idea of like, well, what if I did this? It's something that's been around in literature forever. I mean, you can say that when you write a story, you're speculating anyway. But sometimes most people are doing like reportage, or they're like writing about like autobiographical, biographical pieces. But what happens when you start to actually put in like things like magic, or like, you know, science fiction, or, you know, these different types of supernatural elements? You're speculating and you're intersecting the real with the, you know, with the unreal. So that's kind of like what that is as a genre piece. Of course, you do like the subgenres, right? You know, for instance, Tananarive, who is like the black female Stephen King. She lives in Los Angeles. She primarily writes horror, but she has a very strong like civil rights. Her father was a civil rights attorney, so a very strong like civil rights piece for her work. I find that whenever people of color are writing this type of work, it can't help but intersect with our politics. And even though Nettie, for instance, in her panel was talking about she doesn't really go to write a political piece, it ends up reflecting that because that's the type of person she is. So that's where the speculative umbrella comes from, you know. Anyway.
That's what's up.
Yeah.
Where do you see the genre in, say, 5 years? I mean, at one point it was Octavia Butler. And that's all you heard.
That's right.
It was about Octavia Butler.
Right.
Now, we just had a panel where you was hosting 3 other women.
Oh.
That, you know, and I'm sure there's more than that. Where do you see this genre going in 5 to 10 years? And do you see it breaking up into subgenres under that now?
I think it's already starting to do that a little bit. I mean, because people, like for instance, there's this brother, these brothers actually, Milton Davis and Balagoon Ojitaje. They have a company out of Atlanta where they do primarily speculative fiction. So you have people who are doing like, you familiar with steampunk? You have steampunk. So basically like black speculative culture that's happening in the Victorian era. They're already doing that. They have a new book out called The City that's about what they call cyber funk. You know, so it's like black cyberpunk. And so I've been thinking about, I'm from the South, so I'm thinking about like what does the future of Southern space look like? You know, so I'm kind of marrying like some of the really, really serious issues that are happening in my home state of Mississippi, particularly in Jackson, and how do you take like speculative fiction as a tool to talk about what the future of that black space is going to be like? So I call it like the cyber trap, because the cyber trap. You're still talking like trap music, but also because people still think about the South as like this not deindustrialized kind of like agrarian space, but it's a very, you know, urbanized space, right? So, you know, so how does that look like? And also, I'm really interested in old school technologies like hoodoo and like voodoo and different types of religious practices and how they intersect as a type of technology with cyber technology. So I call that conjure punk, which I think Nalo Hopkinson is like the godmother of, because she already interjects that kind of stuff into her work anyway. Conjure punk. Yeah. I have a character called the Bokor Assassin that you would just love.